a vested interest in becoming engaged. Lacoste has done this and invested in crocodilians in certain places. Coca-Cola is also marketing a lot of its products using the polar bears you probably see if you watch TV. And this also not only returns resources, but gets the message across to society. And this is an important value of species conservation, is to be able to transmit the message to the public. Again, species are the face of biodiversity. They are at the forefront of this. They are probably in the trenches of the plight that we are always struggled with in terms of conserving biodiversity, and they can be extremely effective messengers of what we're trying to do. So that's why we brought the Save Our Species initiative together with the World Bank, IUCN, and ourselves, and now we have been joined by Nokia, the French GEF, and hopefully very soon other companies. We did an extensive work with a marketing company in Japan to try to attract Japanese brands to this effort, and there are others that are under active discussion that JC and his team are busy with. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Gustavo. That's really interesting, and I've never seen an analysis of the GEF before from a point of view of species conservation, so that's really interesting. Adam, do you want to come and talk to us? Adam, as I said earlier, is from Synchronicity. Welcome.
I have a very low-tech presentation. Welcome, everybody. I have a degree in history and have been professionally investing in global financial markets for the past 18 years. I've been an experimental philanthropist in the areas of art, education, health, and microfinance. Over the past 2 years, I've been the chairman
Speak up, please.
Sorry.
I can't hear you.
So start again. I have a degree in history and have been professionally investing in global markets for 18 years. I've been an experimental philanthropist in the areas of art, education, health, and microfinance. And over the past 2 years, I've been the chairman of Singers the Earth, a UK charity focused on awareness and funding for conservation. I love markets and I love animals. You would assume I would be a cheerleader for the current new paradigm in conservation. The idea that ecosystem services and new financial engineering approaches to conservation hold the key to saving species and unlocking the door to massive new pools of funding. Instead of waving the ecosystem service banner, I find the current conservation paradigm disturbing on multiple levels, intuitively, intellectually, and philosophically. I even find the topic of my talk disturbing, investing in species. It used to be giving to species. Now I see more and more species proposals being called business plans, and the language of the conservation movement is slowly morphing into business speak to attract corporations and appease governments. We live in a time when the private sector and free market capitalism stalks the earth. Development in ecosystem services are new tools to keep feeding himself and make sure his mission to keep growing and growing and growing at all costs does not get questioned. There is currently a structural conflict of interest between the interest of governments and corporations' need to exponentially grow and our desire to save species. We need to acknowledge this elephant in the room. Corporations and government organizations throw species conservation scraps from their total budgets and profits. These scraps to a financially starved segment of conservation are very welcome, and ravenous organizations' hope of more food is leading to a shift in presentation, language, and tactics. There are two pertinent wise old sayings. Firstly, don't bite the hand that feeds you, and beggars can't be choosers. We need to accept that about 70% of life on Earth has no validated service for man. In the current paradigm, no matter how hard the conservationists on the ground work, if we don't change the system, these 70% will be wiped out. Ecosystem services reinforces the current paradigm that man can do what he wants, renews and legitimizes his license to kill. This is now getting the endorsement of most of the conservation movement. Cygnus to Earth supports the Amphibian Survival Alliance. I personally think frogs are wondrous creatures. It gives me personal pleasure when I see a frog. It disturbs me that amphibian numbers are collapsing. I don't need to be sold a tenuous link that it's the canary in the coal mine, or that it's the indicator of freshwater water systems that serve man. I don't need to be told that it potentially holds the cure for cancer. I don't need to be sold the idea that we can use a frog to create a project with an indigenous tribe somewhere that will unbalance them, but help them create an ecotourism resort, which will really help local economic development. Show me a picture of a frog and you have me at hello. For the sake of understanding in the culture that thrives on labels, let's label me an intrinsic. On the other side of the intrinsic coin, you have the current zeitgeist sweeping through conservation, the ecosystem services paradigm that wants to turn all of nature into a commodity. The problem I have as an intrinsic is that the services model has placed all creatures on Earth on death row. The only way you can get a pardon is if you can prove you provide a service to Homo sapiens. You'll probably find that the money that goes into individual species projects from foundations and private donors is given from intrinsics, and most people working to save species are intrinsics. Big money can come from government or corporations, but it's really more likely they'll flow to larger ecosystem projects rather than specific species projects, as it's much harder to argue the case that many of these species can serve man. Unless, of course, it's for more funding for the larger ecosystem projects. Intrinsics are trying to adapt to this model to get new funding. This is counterproductive as it will attract limited funding and fundamentally undermines its end game of saving species. The new conservation movement involves commoditizing more of nature. You hear language like we need to make animals and forests worth more alive than dead. Giving bluefin tuna a price makes it a precious commodity to be warehoused and hoarded. Giving it a market price does not give it any protection. What it does do is create a market incentive to kill it and store it. By giving a living being a market mechanism does not provide it with any benefits except to those who are going to make the market. What something costs is not its intrinsic value, it is its price. What we need is an improved value system, not more market prices. Human beings themselves used to be priced this way for millennia. Only the last 200 years have we decided that giving them a market price was wrong and robs humans of their intrinsic individual worth. Both slavery and apartheid were economic systems that were effectively working and created efficient pricing for cheap labor. They were demolished by an act of faith, not by an act of the market. The market is not benevolent nor predatory. It is all-consuming. Its current structure is an amoral vacuum cleaner of life. The saving species sector needs to stop selling fear. The argument that biodiversity loss will lead to economic and social upheaval argument is just not working. It is too complicated. The linkages can be open to debate. Urban masses cannot relate as they feel they're doing just fine without any nature. The military-industrial complex has cornered the market on fear. Man's fear of his neighbors and nation-states' fear of not having access to resources and energy is far more real to most people than abstract concepts like climate change and environmental collapse. Their fear machine generates $1.7 trillion annually, and I'm afraid there's very little chance of us tapping into any of that money. On August 23rd, an international group of prominent scientists signed the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, in which they proclaimed their support for the idea that animals are conscious and certain animals are aware to the degree that humans are. Everyone in this room intuitively knows that. Now we need to sell this idea. This is our product. We need to sell the value of life. The path we need to take is not the road of economic development, but consciousness development. In order to save other species, we need to change the consciousness of our species. Last week, I saw a crazy article in the Wall Street Journal that I never thought I would ever see. McDonald's is opening a vegetarian-only restaurant in India. Now we have the eco-friendly Mac Alotica to take on the all-powerful Big Mac. One will open near Sikh Holy Temple, and the next one hopes to capitalize on visitors to a Hindu pilgrimage site that draws several 100,000 of worshippers each year. This example illustrates the way forward. The current mode of trying to stop McDonald's relentless demand for beef and all the energy and habitat and destruction that comes with that is either protest McDonald's, become an anti-capitalist protester, or try and stop people buying from McDonald's, or I suppose in the new paradigm we'd want to tax McDonald's and give that money to Red Plus projects. This would not stop demand, neither of these would stop the demand for hamburgers, but a more enlightened consumer can dramatically lower the carbon environmental impact on the McDonald's restaurant. I never would have imagined a vegetarian McDonald's, but what amazes me is how seamlessly a company can mold itself to the needs of a more enlightened consumer base. Conservation should be a cultural force that encourages societies to reflect upon and regulate the relationship with the natural world. We need to culturally re-engage. All children are structurally intrinsics. We need to nurture young intrinsics and harness their energy and keep them. We need to work together under one banner. We need to create and agree upon a united form of messaging. Although the species specialists have to compete for funding, I feel we need to drop the politics and create a common united voice. We also need to create a new central narrative around the value of life, not around everyone bickering over whose species has more value to humans. We also need an intrinsic manifesto and to create a new, fresh, united drive to create new ideas, new money and creativity to our Save the Species movement. Thank you, and Kamsa Amida.
Thanks, Adam, for opening up the breadth of the conversation more than anyone here was expecting. So I think this will lead to some discussion, which is great. And I'm really sad that I've got to rush next door to the meeting, but I'll be back as soon as I can be. I'm going to hand over to Valerie.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Gustavo and Adam. So what I'm going to ask is that the panelists come up, and we really do want to make this an interactive session, because I know a lot of you have been sitting in a lot of audiences today, yesterday, you're going to be doing it again tomorrow. So we're going to be asking you to contribute as much as we're asking the panelists just to start off and challenge us with some questions. So let me start with this question. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah, there's one microphone here.
Okay, perfect. So let me start with this question for the panelists. And I'm going to ask the panelists to just spend a couple of minutes responding to the question and just try and give us a response that will make us think and that the audience can react to. So here's the first question, and JC, I'm going to start with you. So we've heard a lot from Adam and from Gustavo about the need for funding for species. We heard it from Simon. He said we're starved for funding for species. Why does it matter? Funding for biodiversity has doubled in the last couple of years. Isn't that enough? Why do we need specific funding for species?
Okay, thanks for starting with me. Well, I think Simon said it at the beginning. What actually prompted this session was the fact that we received, when we opened the first call for proposal for SOS, we were inundated by requests. So we questioned ourselves. There were two sides of the coin. The first thing we say, wow, there is a huge demand outside, and there is no way we are going to fill this demand. The second thing why we prompted this session is the fact that when we look at the projects themselves, and talking to what Adam said about we need basically to advocate for the conservation of life, we didn't find, the review panel didn't find the project very, very convincing and appealing. So that were the two things. There is a huge demand, and on the other side, and it's really important, Gustavo said it. I mean, it was said multiple times. Not going to repeat the interest of species conservation. They are, in a way, ambassadors. They are numerous. There are 17,000 threatened today. I mean, we can fund a few dozen projects. Even the Jeff, with its huge, its huge power, can fund a good number, but still a small number compared to what is needed. So we need to scale up. And one way, which what is really important, is species is actually a way to simplify our message of conservation. We keep complicating our message, our own life. We make the message really complicated for an outside audience by ecosystem services, by talking about multiple benefits, multiple approach, which are, I mean, they have their value, they are important to invest in, but for the people in the street doesn't mean anything. We are confusing them. Species, they know what it is. We know there's 17,000 threatened out of 60,000, so if you, that makes potentially hundreds of thousands of species that needs funding, so we need to scale up. And we need also to be better at doing that. So that's also what this session, I think I understand, is about, is how we're becoming better at convincing donors, are getting more support from the people in the street. So, with it.
Perfect. Yep. Do you want to pass on?
Sure. I'm not sure I agree with you necessarily that funding towards conservation overall has doubled. I would say that funding for conservation for development, if you put that in the sector, has helped it drastically increase. But at the same time, I think we should note that the drivers of biodiversity loss have gone up massively, and so have the threat rates of species. And whether we should focus on species or not, it's just a fundamental values-based question. So either you appreciate the rest of life or you don't. So if we appreciate the rest of life, then we should be investing in species. And just a really quick point, if I might, we have 7,000 people that have signed up for this convention here. And we have a program called EDGE, which focuses on the 100 most evolutionary distinct and globally endangered species. So these are the most distinct species on the planet that are most threatened. So 80% of the, or 85% of the amphibians on that list are not receiving conservation attention, or very little. And 75% of the mammals are receiving little or no conservation attention. And we're about to release a book in a few days highlighting the 100 most threatened species. And in there, many of them are not receiving conservation attention. So it really makes me question, what is everyone doing here? If the 100 most threatened species on this planet are not receiving conservation attention.
Yolanda, let me ask you a slightly different question following what Jonathan said. So if there's a lot of species, we clearly need, as Jason said, we need to fund species. And Jonathan said we need to start looking at some of those species because it's a values-based question. That's why we're all here. So tell me this, in a resource-constrained environment, what are we willing to stop funding to start funding species?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends who you speak to. Anyone's going to give you a range of answers. I think I would be reluctant to come up with something because someone somewhere is always going to disagree, and I think then it diverts the debate in the wrong direction. I think that, as with most resources, there is usually enough to go around as long as people understand where they're investing, and I also hate the word investing. I mean, Adam, I'm completely with you. The business case makes me cringe, but as a head of an organization who deals with this all the time, we got used to using the lingo. There's the old arguments about the whales and the Northern Sea and the ice and how that money wasn't necessarily available for the AIDS orphans down in Southern Africa. And so resources are not always interchangeable, and I don't think you can always go to a donor and say, well, if I put a bleeding heart case that really pulls at your heartstrings a little bit stronger than the guy next door, I should get the money. I don't think the debate should be about competing and creating competing causes, because I think we lose a lot of the discussion around how we need to create a planet that has equitable resource allocation, and we need to just understand how to reduce our impacts and how to do a lot less damage. If we're going to continue living the way we are in a society that's intrinsically destroying everything around us, there will never be enough resources to mitigate and address that. Rather, we need to be addressing the way we are fundamentally destroying everything around us first. All the species conservation in the world is not going to address the 17,000 you mentioned, and JC, we just need to point out those are the ones we know about, never mind the ones we don't. So it cannot be a matter of remedial action, because then there's never going to be enough money. But if I could just make one point, and that's on the original question which you asked the others, and I really want to answer that. in addition to everything that's been said, none of which I disagree with, but I think I just want to add one more element, and I don't think that the emphasis for me is on species conservation. It's actually on conservation. Because ultimately, if you're doing species conservation correctly, you should be focusing on addressing the threats. So if the threats to a species are habitat destruction, you're going to be doing habitat and ecosystem conservation. If the species are persecution, poaching, shooting, poisoning, trade, etc., and you're addressing that, you're doing conservation. And so to me, that's where the emphasis lies. It's on addressing the threats, undoing the damage that human beings are doing with the development trajectory we've set ourselves. And that's really what we're focusing on. We're just saying that those are the species that are affected, but ultimately it's a damaging and destructive human lifestyle that we're actually addressing. And if you need to bring it back to us, well, that brings the argument back to us because of the way we're living as human beings. So it's ultimately conservation. And that's really, I think, where the discussion should be heading.
Thank you. Adam, do you want to take a go? I know you just spoke, but...
I don't know, it's all false choices. I mean, to me, when I meet a passionate frog person or passionate amphibian person, it just gets you excited about life. I think I got into this one animal at a time. You know, most people think biodiversity is a washing powder. You know, I think where the